Hello everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at the get help commandlet. So this video is part of a bunch that I'm putting together around PowerShell basics. So in here, we're going to talk about using help to find commandlets, using get help parameters, and finally looking at the help syntax. So to start off here, using help to find commandlets. So the first thing before you ever get started with using help here, you want to make sure that you're on a computer that has the help updated on it. So for instance here, let me clear the screen here. You can run on a computer with an internet connection the commandlet update help. And just running that on its own, we'll go ahead and give that a whirl here. That will go out to Microsoft's uh, servers out on the internet and download all of the help content for the different commandlets and modules that you have installed on your computer. So some might come down, some might not here. So kind of ignore that if you will here. So it's saying that we weren't able to find this for some of the modules that are present on here, which is not unexpected. Okay, but that gets everything updated so that you can now use the PowerShell's help system to its full capability here. So when looking at it, one of the things that we might want to do here is to be able to use help to find the different commandlets that are available. So if I so this computer that I'm teaching on here, that I'm doing this video on, is a 2016 server configured as a domain controller and a DNS server. So whatever the typical stuff is, that's going to come with that. So for instance, if I were to type out get module list available, we could see the different modules that happen to be here. All right. So let's say I wanted to find commandlets around maybe let's say Active Directory, for instance. So I could use the get help commandlet here and give it a name. And let's say I want to look for users, right? So I could use a wildcard, users, close the wildcard. So that will let me see what commandlets happen to be available here. Right? So anything that has users in it. Maybe we'll refine this a little bit. Let's say AD user, right? Something like that. And we could see specifically here, this is around the Active Directory results. So we could see the module that it came out of. Right? So knowing how PowerShell names commandlets where you have the noun and the verb part, and this could be particularly useful here to see for the noun 80 users, that's the object that this commandlet's going to be affecting. And then we look at the nouns. Get, which is like a list or a query or a view type of thing. New is creating, remove is deleting, and set is modifying something that's already there. And so the name of the commandlet can be a good indicator as to what that commandlet's going to do and what object it's going to be doing that to. Right? So that allows me to use these wildcard searches to find what's there. Right? So if I wanted to change this around here, maybe I wanted to look for things that have service in them. And these would be the different commandlets available on the computer uh, that have service in their name somewhere. So if you wanted to, let's say, just show ones that end with service, just change your query here, take the star off the end of it, and we could see this. So it's just showing commandlets that have service on the name, service on the end, of the commandlet name. Now, so with this here, this allows me to significantly cut down on the amount of commandlets I might have to sort through to find what it is I'm looking to do. Okay? Because if you just kind of add up everything on this computer to start with here, so I'll use the commandlet get command, which will display all of the commandlets that are installed on this particular computer, and I'll send that over to measure object. And we could see that, there's 2,000 and something there, okay, which is a lot to potentially have to remember. Right? So with help, we could use this to kind of cut down on what's showing up here. Right? Now, in addition to just commandlets, though, let me come back here to help here, and let me search on something called, we'll do the wildcard variable wildcard, and let that show up. And what help can also do for you is not just show you results from individual commandlets, but also if there's other things present here. So like for instance, there's a bunch of about files here. Okay, so these about files are like PowerShell's documentation, if you will. Okay, so not about commandlets specifically, but about other things that are present for me to be able to do. Right? So that can also go a long way into allowing us to figure out what's actually present on a computer as far as the PowerShell structure is concerned. So the individual commandlets we can use, and then maybe some of these about files which are describing how different aspects of PowerShell work. Right? So definitely up your alley as well there. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, when you see some people use help, they don't always type out the full commandlet get help. They use the alias of it, which is just help. And that's probably what I'm going to be doing for the rest of this video here, just using the alias of get help, which is just literally the word help. There's also another alias set up for help. It's out of the Linux and Unix world. It's man, M-A-N. So you could use that as well if you're more comfortable in that world. But again, let's say, for instance, we're doing something like this, and notice the result comes back. Right? Now, what is kind of different when you're using the alias is if you have more than one screen of information, it will pause it at one screen of output at a time here. So let's say we'll do something that's, I don't know, gets a lot of results here. And notice how it's pausing there at one screen of information. And if I wanted to, I can hit the space bar and that would give me another screen. I could hit enter and I can get the next line of the result. Or if I didn't want to see the rest of it, I can just do Control C to cancel it to get my cursor back if I wanted to look at it that way. Okay, so when a lot of people are using help, they're using literally the alias help. Right? So you could use that, or if you feel like typing the full syntax, feel free to use the get-help commandlet itself, the full name. Right? Okay, so with that being said, let's go back here to my PowerPoint slide. Um, and let's talk about the individual parameters that go along with get help. Okay, so there is kind of a basic syntax that goes along with help. There's a full syntax, show window, and online. Okay, there are going to be some other things available here. I'm just going through the ones that are probably going to be the most popular and the ones that I tend to use the most when I'm interacting with this. Right? So when I teach PowerShell classes to students, when I use PowerShell myself, these are the ones that I find myself coming to potentially the most. So that's kind of where I'm targeting here. Right? So with that being said, so when we have, let's say, an individual commandlet now. So we've used the kind of the wildcard searches to find what we're looking for here. So let's maybe bring up the AD user one. And then we want to actually look at individual specifics here. So like for instance, maybe we'll do, let's use help, and name we'll use, I don't know, let's do a star service, right? Show me the commandlets that end with the word service. So let's maybe pick on, let's say I wanted to find, a list of services on my computer, right? That might be the get service commandlet here. So I can go ahead and use help with name, and we'll do get dash service. So now this is the kind of basic output for help when you're pointing it at a particular commandlet. So we could see a synopsis. That's kind of a brief summary of what the commandlet does. There's a more detailed description here. There's a syntax block, so we'll spend some more time looking at that in a moment. Notice the more, which means there's more than one page of info here. So I'll go ahead and click that. I could see the rest of the description, some related link info, some remarks, and that's in essence the brief view of help here, kind of the default view. All right. So the help commandlet, the get help commandlet, also has some parameters on it. So one of them would be full, and so that can look at the help, but in a more detailed format. So you can hit more and notice it's getting into a lot further detail of things. So if we kind of scroll through here and look, there's a lot more information to be had here. Now, I don't particularly like the full help, how it displays out in the console here. So instead, the parameter I find myself using more often if I want to look at the full help would be show window. And so we open that up, and that will open up the help as its own separate window that you could then kind of play around with here. So if you happen to work with multiple monitors, this might be nice. Like you could have your console open on one screen here and then have the help that you can kind of drag out and put it somewhere else, put it on a separate monitor, for instance. All right. So then if we look at it, we could see in the show window version of the help here, there's info about each of the individual parameters. So display name, exclude, include, so we could see all of the different parameters. We could still see that same syntax block that we were seeing with the default help that we looked at a moment ago. And then we could see things like input output notes, and then finally here, examples. So we could see, for instance, here's a commandlet, what it does. Here's typing something out, here's what it does. So you could see that there is kind of a few different examples here. Now, if examples, though, are what you're after primarily, the online version of the help might be the better option here. All right, so for instance here, if I take help and I point it using the online parameter, that will open up whatever your default browser is, and then specifically go out to the page on Microsoft's documentation. So if you look up here, you can see this is going out to docs.microsoft.com, and we could see the info about that particular commandlet. All right, so we could see the syntax, kind of in a little bit different format here, how it's displayed. Description, the example formatting is a lot better. So than what we see with show window or even just in the console itself. So we could see all the different examples. And then if I keep scrolling down through this, again, I could see details about each of the individual parameters. All right. So this is by far going to be the most detail that we can see when we are looking at the documentation that goes with the commandlet. All right. So a lot of good information there that we don't potentially have to, I don't know, just Google search it to find things out here. Okay, so using the particular web page that comes with each commandlet, using show window, or using just the default help that comes with each commandlet here. So there's a lot of different resources for finding info about the commandlets that we're going to be looking for. All right. So now the next part here, breaking down that individual information here. So the actual help syntax that we have. Right, so things like the basic parameter info, parameter sets, required versus optional parameters, and positional parameters. So there's a lot of information that can be gathered just from looking at the syntax that comes in the help when we look at it. Right? So let's flip back over to our VM here. And let's just open up again the help for a particular commandlet, and we'll just work with the syntax area and pluck all the different pieces of information that are available in here. All right? So some of the first things to potentially look at here is looking at the info that we can easily pick up. So for instance, I could see anything that starts with a dash would be a parameter. So the get service commandlet has a computer name parameter. It has dependent services, display name, exclude, include, required services. Um, so then we see a repeat here, dependent services, exclude, include, input object. All right, so we could see each thing that starts with a dash represents a parameter. And then directly after it, if that parameter takes data, you could see what type of object it takes for data. Okay, so PowerShell basically works on top of the .NET framework. So you're seeing .NET objects as the data that a parameter would accept. So one of the more popular .NET objects that we use within PowerShell are going to be string objects. So string is basically like ASCII text. Anything you can type in Notepad, that would be considered a string object. All right. So with it here, we could see that that computer name takes string, and then these two symbols right here, these two brackets, tell me that it takes multiple of them. So this happens to take multiple strings. All right. So if we look at this one right here, I do apologize, it's kind of carriage returning over, but we see input object and then its data type is right here. And so this would be a service controller. All right, so if you're not familiar with .NET, the beginning part represents the namespace. So it's system.string. So you got the namespace and then the class. Then here we have a different namespace, system.serviceProcess, and then the class here, service controller. All right. So in this case, input object accepts a service controller object. Right? And the fact that these brackets are right here tells me it takes multiple of them. Right? So if you look here, quite a few of these commandlets, like you see, name takes multiple strings. Right? Computer name, again, takes multiple strings. Include takes multiple strings. But some of the parameters here don't have any data after them, like they don't take an object. So for instance, like if you look at required services here, see how there's no data type that comes after it. Okay. So that's what we refer to as a switch parameter. So switch parameters, you use them, and when using them, it turns something on. And when you don't use them, something is kept off. It's like kind of like a true or a false, if you will. Something is on or something is off. So you saw me do this with the get help commandlet itself. There was the online parameter, the show window parameter, the full parameter. None of those accepted data. By using the parameter, you're in essence turning something on or setting something to true. All right. So when you see that, like you can see here, dependent services, and then there's no data type there, it immediately goes over to the next parameter, which is display name. All right. And again, required services, there's no data type there. It immediately goes over to the common parameters. All right. Which are a bunch of parameters that are built into just PowerShell. So things like debug, verbose, error action, warning action, stuff like that. Those are lumped under what we call common parameters. All right. So that's the two most common things you'll see for parameters. So parameters that take data and parameters that are just referred to as switch parameters. Right? Now you'll notice though in here that there's a repeat of a lot of the parameters. You see computer name here, and computer name here. So why is it listed 3 times? So what we're getting into is what we refer to as parameter sets. Okay, so that is the grouping of parameters that could be used together when using the cmdlet. Okay, so if you have, in this case, I have 3 parameter sets. So here's the first parameter set. We got this blank line, the next parameter set, blank line, and then finally the last one here. So there's 3 of them. And there's going to be something unique in each one of them. So for instance, in this last one here, name is going to be the unique one, the unique parameter. In this middle one here, it's this one right here, input object. And then up here, in the first one, display name is the unique one. So if you're using display name, you can only use it with these other parameters. All right? So since you don't see name up here, I could not combine display name and name together. So those would not work. All right? So you'll see that happen in quite a few of the different cmdlets that are there. So if I open help on a different one here, maybe we'll do get event log. We could see, for instance, here, there's 2 parameter sets. Here's the first one, there's the space, here's the second one. All right? So if we look here, we could see, like, for instance, list is unique down here. It's not up here. Log name is unique up here. It's not down here. Okay, so those are the ones that cannot be combined together. Computer name you could use in both because it's listed in both. So there's computer name there and computer name there. Okay, so what happens if you try to do it? So let's say we'll type get event log and log name. Let's maybe look at the system log and we'll use list. So I'm specifically using 2 parameters out of different parameter sets. And you'll find that PowerShell doesn't like that. Okay, so see, parameter set cannot be resolved using the named parameters. So PowerShell cannot figure out which parameter set you mean because you're using ones out of different parameter sets. All right? So it errors out. So I could do each one separately. So I could do log name, and pardon me, I'll just use newest so it doesn't like scroll the screen here. So log name worked, and list will work. All right, but they can't be used together. Okay, so that's what different parameter sets are. So it's the grouping of parameters that could be used together when running the particular cmdlet, right, if we wanted to do that. Right? Now, when you look at, let's kind of break a few more things down here because get event log has a little more action going on in the syntax here. So for instance, you could see there's a lot more different data types. So we could see instance ID takes a 64-bit integer. The after parameter takes a date time object. Before takes a date time object. Newest takes a 32-bit integer. Right? And then you can also see the difference between a parameter that accepts a single value and a parameter that accepts multiple values. So if I look at log name here, I could see it takes a single string. Whereas if I look at username, it takes multiple strings. Again, notice the addition of these 2 brackets here right next to each other. Okay, notice log name, the string does not have those. So this tells me log name takes a single value, username would accept multiple values. Newest takes a single value, single integer. Index takes multiple 32-bit integers. All right? So that'll give you an idea if a parameter will accept just one value to it or if it will accept multiple values to it. All right? Now, in addition, though, you'll see there's lots more brackets than just the ones that tell me if a parameter accepts multiple values. Um, So we could see, like, for instance, there's brackets around the parameter itself. there's brackets kind of around the whole thing. Okay. And each of those different sets of brackets is telling you a different fact about the parameter itself. All right. So again, what were those facts that we were looking at here? Oops, hold on one sec. So what were those facts that we were looking at here? So the first fact is whether a parameter is required or optional, right? So that means, are you forced to use it if you want to use the commandlet, or you can use it if you want, but you don't have to, right? So that's something to keep in mind when we're using different commandlets here, or when we're using different parameters on a commandlet. Okay, so if I come back into my VM here and I go and look, let's say for instance I type get event log and just hit enter on its own. You'll notice it doesn't do anything. It needs a value supplied to log name. So if I give it a name, so let's say I want the system log, we could see it spits that out for us. All right. Um, so that would be like a required. Another word for it might be mandatory. So a required versus a mandatory parameter. You have to supply it. Now, not every commandlet works that way. So, for instance, if I did get not get system get service, we could see that one runs on its own without needing any parameters. But I could supply some if I wanted to. Like I can focus on using name if I wanted to do that. Or I could use computer name, something like that. Okay, so these would be optional parameters. You don't have to use them when running the commandlet, but you can if you want to change kind of what the commandlet's going to do, what its output's going to look like. Okay, so again, when we're looking at the help here, okay, how do I tell the parameters that are required or mandatory, whatever word you want to use there, and the parameters that are optional. All right. The brackets actually tell us that. Okay. So what we're looking at here, let me change my pen color to red, is we're looking at parameters that take data. Guys, that's specifically what I'm looking at here. Parameters that don't take data, they're always optional. So switch parameters are always going to be optional. So for instance, you see list here, that doesn't have a data type that goes with it. And as string over here, that again does not have a data type that goes with it. Guys, so those are always optional. And you can kind of see that there is a set of brackets surrounding them, but it's not really signifying much. Okay, switch parameters are always going to be optional. So now let's focus on parameters here that have a data type, that take data. All right. So let's look first of all at computer name right here. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm combining the parameter and its data type. I'm basically treating it as one unit. Okay? And what I'm looking for is if that whole unit is enclosed in a set of brackets. And you could see the opening bracket right there, and more importantly, the closing bracket right there. Okay, so when we see that, that is basically telling us that this is, and I'll just put O here for an optional parameter. All right. Now let's go and look at this one right here. Let's look at log name. All right, let me kind of draw that out here. So I'm drawing what you're going to group together. Guys, so we're kind of grouping the parameter and its data type together. And notice there's an opening bracket here, yes, but it doesn't close over here. Okay, so there's no closing bracket at the end there. So the whole unit here, everything I've got circled in red, is not enclosed in a set of brackets. So that makes that a required parameter, or mandatory if you wanted to use that. Okay, so that means to run this commandlet, you're going to need to supply something to log name. So that is a mandatory or a required parameter. Okay? So now let's look at a couple other ones here. So for instance, if we look at newest right here. So again, I'm going to circle in red what I want you to pay attention to, and then notice that the whole thing is enclosed in a set of brackets. So there's the closing bracket right there. There's the opening bracket right there. Actually, let me change my pen to green. You can see that a little better. So there's the opening bracket right there. There's the closing bracket right there. And again, remember, if the whole thing is enclosed in brackets, it is optional. All right, so that's what we're looking for there. All right. All right, so now, for the most part, most of the parameters that go with a commandlet are going to be optional. Okay, so a commandlet normally has very few required or mandatory parameters. Okay, most of them are going to be optional. That's just normally how the design is when you're looking at commandlets. Okay? So required or mandatory versus optional. Okay, so that's the bracket system we're looking at here. So again, if the whole thing is enclosed in brackets, like we see on newest here, that means it's optional. If the whole thing is not enclosed in a set of brackets, it's mandatory or required, like we see up here. Okay. Now, normally to shorten up the system, what I look at is I always look at the end of the data type and I look to see if there's a closing bracket there. Okay, because sometimes the opening brackets mess you up. Okay, because notice there is an opening bracket there, but it's not the same thing. Okay, I'll talk about what it is in a minute here, but it's not the same thing. So what we're looking for is if there's a closing bracket after the data type, okay, that would tell me that that parameter is optional, right? So let's take username here. So again, this is what I'm looking at, and notice there's a closing bracket right there after the data type. So that tells me username is going to be optional. And again, let's go back to log name. Notice there's no closing bracket after the data type there. So if there's no bracket, mandatory or required. Okay? So that's that part of it. Okay? Now the next thing that the brackets can tell me is if a parameter is positional or not. So what the positional system means is some of the parameters, you don't actually have to type them out to use them. Right? So for instance, like with get event log, there's actually two positional parameters here. It's log name and instance ID. Okay, so those are positional. So what does that mean? Let me show you. So if I'm typing out get event log and I do log name, let's look at system, and let me just do, I'll use newest just so the result doesn't scroll the whole screen here. But if I run this like this, yeah, that's what we expect for the output. It's the 5 most recent entries in the system log. But notice that I don't actually have to type log name. All right, so if I just run this on its own, you'll notice it works exactly the same because log name is a positional parameter. Okay, so basically what it's looking at is PowerShell sees this as a string object. It's just a bunch of text, and it's feeding it to the first parameter that accepts data positionally. Okay, so that value was fed right to that parameter. Now, are all parameters that way? No, they're not. So here's how you can tell. Okay, so first of all, we're looking at parameters that accept a data type. Okay, so as string and list, those are switch parameters. This doesn't apply for them. Okay, so they're always optional. There's no data to supply to them, right? So positional doesn't work for them. So it has to be a parameter that accepts a data type. Okay, now when we look at it, if the parameter itself is wrapped in a set of brackets. Okay, let me use my pen here again. So I'm looking specifically at the parameter itself, and notice it's wrapped in a set of brackets. It's contained in a set of brackets. Okay, so that means it's positional. Look at computer name right here. Okay, and notice it's not wrapped in a set of brackets. Yes, there's an opening one right there, but remember that's being closed over here. So this opening bracket means that parameter's optional, right? So the openings don't tell you the full story. What you're looking for is if the parameter itself, so if there was a closing bracket right there, computer name would have been positional. But in this case, it's not there. So that means it's not. So what that means is if we are going to use computer name, we have to type it out on the command line. Okay? So I would have to manually type out that parameter. Like remember I used newest down here. So if you look at newest, you notice there's no closing bracket right there. Okay, so if there's no closing bracket, the parameter is not positional. So you have to type it out. So in this case, when we're looking at get event log name, see the closing bracket right there. So that means it's positional. And notice instance ID is also positional. See the closing bracket right there. Okay. So that's where, like I'm saying, the opening brackets don't tell me a lot, because notice instance ID, there's two opening brackets right there. All right. So with this, look at the closes. So there's a closing bracket after instance ID. So after the parameter itself, if there's a closing bracket, that means it's positional. All right. And again, this closing bracket after the data type meant it was optional. All right. So again, I never really look at the opening brackets. I always look at the closing ones. Um, so now, how can we work this, right? How can a commandlet have multiple positional parameters? Well, it pays attention to the position. So this would be the first one over here. So this one would be the first one. This would be the second one. And so if you have data on the line, it pays attention to where it is. So notice log name takes a string, instance ID takes some type of number, 64-bit integer. So when using that, if I type get event log, let's do, let's type them all out here. So log name system and instance ID, I don't know, let's try one here, 5. Oop, no, we don't have that. 5. How about a 10? Okay, cool. We got one of those. All right. So notice that worked. Okay. So hey, cool. We're manually using the parameters, and that's fine. But notice these are both positional. And notice if I get rid of them, the commandlet will still work exactly. All right. So there we go. Works exactly the same. Now, what makes them, how you can get away with having two positional parameters is, again, this data was fed. Let me pull the help back open here. Okay, so this data was fed to log name, because that's the first positional parameter, and this block of data here was fed to there. Okay, and again, PowerShell uses the space as the delimiter. So how does it tell it's two separate pieces of data? There's a space there. So if your data has spaces in it, like it's a text string that has spaces in it, you'd have to enclose it in quotes for PowerShell to treat it as one piece of data. But anyway, so that's how they're matched to each other. Now, what happens if you flipped them, right? So let's say, we just saw this run right here. It worked great. But what if I flipped the pieces of info? Will that work? Well, it depends on the commandlet, right? So if I run it on its own, this particular way is going to blow up, right? So now what made it blow up? So for instance, you see here it's looking for instance ID, cannot convert value system to type int64. So what's actually happening here is it took the value 10 and threw that to log name. Okay, so that's where that went, and that takes a string. Now, numbers can be considered strings. They can be converted to string objects. Like you can type the number 10 in Notepad and you're fine. However, this value was fed to instance ID, and that cannot be converted to a 64-bit integer. So that's where it choked. Okay. So that's where it says cannot convert value system to type int 64 because it's trying to send this data value to the instance ID parameter, and that takes a 64-bit integer. All right. Now, if I wanted to fix it, I could tell this that number 10 belongs to instance ID. So now that's not a positional parameter anymore. You're manually specifying the value, and then system is the first unaccounted for data value. So that's going to be fed to the first positional parameter, which was log name. All right. So if we look up here again, log name was the first positional parameter. All right. So that's how the positional system works. So again, if you look into the syntax and find the parameter itself, if it's enclosed in its own set of brackets, that means it is positional. And if it's not, it's considered not positional. All right. So with those, you can just feed a string to it and it'll work, or you could type out the parameter itself. But parameters that are not positional, you always have to type them out in order to be able to use them. All right. So one last thing I want to note here, because again, this syntax has some different stuff in it. So I want to make sure this doesn't confuse anybody either. And that would be like you look at parameters like entry type. And what this is showing is it's not showing that it's a switch. Okay, so it's not a switch parameter. It doesn't take a certain kind of object. It shows acceptable values. So what it's looking here is if you see after parameter, you see a curly bracket. So when you have an opening and a closing curly bracket, that's a type of object in PowerShell called a script block. And when you see a script block with a bunch of words in it separated by pipe characters, that tells you what the acceptable values are for that particular parameter. So in this case, we look here, entry type takes those 5 different words for its data. All right. So you'll see that on some commandlets do have parameters that have this acceptable value area. Okay, so that tells you exactly what you're going to want to type in there. All right. So that's pretty much it for what we can decipher out of the syntax. All right. Now, again, one last thing to show here as well. If that ever gets to be a bit overwhelming, okay, like you look at some commandlets and they have just a help block that is just outrageous. So if I happen to look at like help on maybe a new 80 user, okay, look at the amount of parameters that are available, and you may not even know where to start, right? So you could see, like, for instance, name is positional because of this set of brackets right here. Notice if you took the whole thing, the parameter and its data type, notice there's no closing bracket right here. So that means that name is mandatory. You have to use it. Um, so I mean, again, you can pick out some facts here. Notice auth type. See how there's a script block. And so you could use negotiate or basic in there, those words. Here's one, change password at logon. See, it takes a Boolean value. So that means a true or false. So PowerShell has variables for those, $true and $false. You could see things like, let's see here, smart logon required, Boolean, there's another one. So some other basic ones. State takes a string. Street address takes a string. And notice a single string. Okay, you notice you don't see that. Those brackets that tell me it takes multiple values. Look at this one, principals allowed to delegate to account. See how that has that they're telling me it takes multiple AD principals. So you can pick out a lot of the facts here just with the stuff that I've gone over. All right. Now, in addition to that, you can, if you wanted to, look at some of the examples on the help as well. So it's typically like if I'm using a commandlet for the first time and I look at this help and I'm just like, whoa, that is way too much stuff that I have to deal with here. So PowerShell, hey, help me out here. So new AD user, and maybe we'll do online. And when I pop open the online version of that help, usually the first thing I might go down to is the examples and then start seeing some of these parameters used in context, if you will, with some of these examples. So this one has, 4 different examples on it, and again, describing what it does. All right. Um, so this is making a user called Chew David. I have no clue what that name is, but anyway, seems to be popular for whoever made this help page. Um, so anyway, so that's using the examples, and that might be a good place to start. Okay, so every commandlet, the help on it is going to have examples. If the syntax block is just too much to kind of wrap your head around to begin with. All right. Also, when looking at the help here, again, we have all of these different parameters. So remember, you can go look at details on each one of them with the description of what it does. All right. So that might be of interest as well. All right. So if you have, if you're kind of intimidated on where to start, that could basically be where to go as well. All right. So with that, that was looking at the get help commandlet. So we talked about using help define commandlets, using the get help, the different parameters on get help like full, online, show window, and all the different syntaxes that go with that. So telling if a parameter takes multiple values, if it's positional, if it's mandatory or optional, the different parameter sets, and things like that. All right. So again, any questions, drop something in the comments. And again, thanks for watching and stay tuned for further PowerShell Basics videos. I'll be doing some more in the series here around how basic PowerShell operation here are what most people are going to want to know when they're first starting off with PowerShell. All right, so thanks again. Have a good one.